All right, today we're going to be talking about evidence of evolution. So, what's the proof that evolution is occurring? Like normal, here's our objectives and our vocab. So, for objectives, you need to be able to tell me or show that evidence is occurring using molecular, anatomical, and developmental proof. Okay? And your vocab is in Quizlet. All right, so evidence or proof of evolution comes in three different forms. You can either have molecular proof, you can have anatomical proof, or you can have developmental proof, which developmental proof is showing similarities developed from a common ancestor. For molecular proof, what we're looking for is that organisms with similar DNA will be more closely related. So we're going to look at their genomes. Remember, from genome, that meant that all of the DNA that an organism has. Okay, so we can either say we're looking at their genomes, we're looking at their DNA, or we're looking at their amino acid sequence. All right, because remember, if things have the same amino acids and they have the same proteins, that means they have the same DNA, because that was where the directions for that came from. So the more similar their proteins are, the more closely they are related from an evolutionary standpoint, because that means their genomes are the same and they have the same DNA. Okay, so looking at the picture, the human, its genome is, or actually this is about the percent of amino acids in a protein. So its amino acids are closer to the monkey than they are to the lamprey, because it's going to be more closely related to the monkey than the lamprey. Our next proof is anatomical proof. And for anatomical proof, what we're doing is we're looking at fossils, okay? So we're comparing structures that were found in older organisms that are found in current organisms to see if they're related. So this is where we get our fossil evidence from. We look at the fossil record. And we either have organisms that have homologous structures, analogous structures, or we find vestigial structures. Remember when we did different types of evolution, we talked about divergent is when they're the same and they become different, whereas convergent is when they start different and they come together, right? So homologous structures are in organisms that went through divergent evolution. So organisms like here we have bat wings, mouse wings, and human arms. They all have the same underlying bone structure, so that's the similarities. But they're all used for very different things, right? Bat wings are used to fly. Human arms are used to like grab things and manipulate objects, whereas mouse forelimbs, their arms, they're used to run. Okay, makes sense? So different uses, but the same underlying structure would be homologous structures, and that came because of divergent evolution, meaning they have a common ancestor who became different and became different organisms. Oh, I just did this. I just explained this to you a second ago. So look at this. Write down our beautiful homologous structure things. And I'm going to the next slide. So, fossil record. The fossil record offers our most direct evidence that evolution took place. Okay, it shows that fossils show the change of structures over time, right? And you can look at older fossils and see if the structures are the same as current or newer fossils. Analogous structures, we talked about these a couple weeks ago, right? These are structures that serve the same function but don't have the same underlying structure, right? So things like the wings of a bird and the wings of an insect, right? The insect wings, if we look at this picture up here, let's see if I can get a pen to work, right? This structure, this insect wing, is very different than, let's say, this bat wing, right? Because like this one has fingers, right? This doesn't even have bones, but they all serve the same function. All of these wings are to fly, right? They all became the same because they need those structures because they live in the same environment, right? So there were different organisms that now came together to look the same, convergent evolution, and those are analogous structures. Tails from a monkey and tails from a squirrel is the same thing. A squirrel's tail doesn't have bones like a monkey's tail does, right? Monkey's tail is an extension of the backbone, but they use them for balance, both of them. Okay, so these do not show common ancestry. They show that evolution happened because they live in similar environments, and the environment is what pushes evolution to occur. So similar to homologous structures, we have vestigial structures. right? Vestigial structures are structures that are present in our bodies or any animal's bodies, but no longer serve a function. And I say they're similar to homologous structures because these are going to show evolutionary history, because these are structures that you still have in you, but that you don't actually use. So they're like almost slowly evolving to go away because you don't need them anymore. So for humans, we have like a tailbone, right? Humans have a tailbone down here. We don't use a tailbone because we don't have a tail, right? And like whales have these legs. Whales have tiny little leg bones in their bodies. Whales don't have legs, right? But whales are mammals. They evolved from organisms that do have legs. So it shows the evolutionary history of an organism, right? So this is looking at anatomical similarities and differences. Developmental proof is next. So developmental proof tells us that the early stages of vertebrate embryos are very similar. Right? It shows us that the more similar they are in development, the more similar they are in their evolutionary history. If we look, all of these organisms have gill slits. That's these things, right? They all have these tails down here. Okay, they all have eye spots right there. Okay, but if we look at the second picture over here, the ones that are more closely related, like these guys, right, more closely related as embryos, they look more similar, are going to be more closely related as full-grown organisms. It just shows kind of some of the evolutionary history. Next, evolutionary relationships. So once we have the proof that evolution occurred and we're using some kind of method to show how related things are, we then take organisms and we can group them or organize them using a cladogram. A cladogram is going to show the evolutionary relationships among organisms. And what we're going to use is derived characteristics, so characteristics that arose in a common ancestor before organisms split. Right? Characteristics that arose in a common ancestor before organisms split. So if I look at this chart, all right, the organism over here has the least amount of traits. And the organism down this end has the most. All right, so when I look, this organism here, I follow him back down, all he has is vertebrae. Okay? This organism, let's say the crocodile here, if I follow it back down, the crocodile has each one of these lines that I go through. So the crocodile is going to have vertebrae, a bony skeleton, forelimbs, amniotic eggs, and post-orbital, whatever that word is. Right? So our organisms are organized from the least amount of traits to the most. Our traits, on the other hand, are organized from this trait down here has the most amount of organisms that have it because all of the organisms above it have it. This trait is the least amount of organisms that have it because I've only got 2 up here who have it. Does that make sense? So last one, derived characteristics. This is when a derived characteristic is going to be below the organism has it. This is what I just went over. And when it's above the organism doesn't have it. So claws and nails is going to be found on all of the guys this way. So lizards, hamsters, and chimpanzees. Whereas the salamander and the salmon do not have claws and nails because it's above them, right? Lungs is found on all of these guys. The only guy who doesn't have lungs is my salmon because it's above them. Okay, that's how you read a cladogram. We're going to do some cladogram stuff this week. Once we show that we can prove evolution, we'll then use that to kind of organize animals. Write down any questions and make sure you wrote your notes in your notebook.